It is a great, great pleasure and an honour to be here at Christian Aid. I've walked past, I live around here, I've walked down the road, walked down Lower Marsh many times. It's wonderful to be inside. And you're a very brave bunch, in truth, for asking me, because I am someone who the Sun newspaper once called the most dangerous woman in Britain. Thank you. As you know, Britain is a very small country and actually relatively safe, which probably explains that. It's always a great delight to celebrate, and I mean celebrate, Black History Month. But I am particularly glad that you've chosen to concentrate on gender and human rights this year. Because if human rights mean anything, they have to be a protection of the vulnerable from the abuses of the powerful. There's lots of ways of thinking about human rights and describing human rights. Article this of convention that, boxes of tricks for the courtroom, all good stuff, but it's dignity, it's equality, and it's fairness, and it's protecting the vulnerable from abuses of power, and there are many of those, and it is often women and children in particular who are amongst the most vulnerable in Britain and in the world. Now, I'm not someone who wants to be part of a competition for victimhood. I don't feel a victim myself. I feel like someone who's had an incredibly fortunate life, as you've heard from Loretta. But I think that when I look at the world today and I look at Britain today, I do think that we as women should have got further by now. Hundreds of years of struggle, still so far to go, decades of equal treatment legislation in Britain alone, and still so far to go to implement and realise the principle of equal treatment in particular. And you at Christian Aid, of course, have a much bigger view than I do as a domestic, scruffy human rights campaigner. You know the scandal of maternal mortality all over the world. A scandal that would be completely unacceptable if those health standards and the lack of services and the lack of resource were applicable to men. But it's allowed to pass because it's women. You know the scandal of mass rape. We've heard a bit about it from Jasmine, the way it's used as a tool of war and of social control and of genocide in various parts of the world. But it's really my task today to remind you of small places close to home, i.e. here in Britain as well. Liberty, the National Council for Civil Liberties, does focus here in Britain. And I'm reminded of Eleanor Roosevelt, who some of us think of as the sort of grandmother of modern post-war international human rights, who said, human rights begin in small places close to home. Places so small that they will never be found on any map of the world. And wasn't she right? So let me remind you that not so many years ago here in England, we talk about rape, what it is for a woman to experience rape. Here in England, it was perfectly acceptable in our criminal justice system for a woman who had been raped to then go to the Old Bailey and face her accuser in the dock, and he was allowed to sack his counsel and sack his lawyers so that he could represent himself and cross-examine that woman in person. And it happened on a regular basis not so long ago in Britain. And the woman in question would feel like she'd been raped all over again, this time in public and this time as part of our justice system. This is 10 years ago, 15 years ago, this sort of thing used to happen. But mercifully, there is something called Article 3 of the Convention on Human Rights, the European Convention, now in our Human Rights Act, much maligned. You've read the newspapers, you know what people say about the Human Rights Act. It's a terrorist charter and it's an unworthy person's charter and it's this, that and the other. It's because we were able to take cases to the European Court of Human Rights to say that is inhuman and degrading treatment, that practice ended. And men are not allowed to cross-examine in person, and courts have to intervene and step in when degrading and irrelevant questioning is put to rape victims, most of whom, not all of whom, are indeed women. That's Article 3 of the Convention, the prohibition on inhuman and degrading treatment and torture. And that is, as we know, what rape is. And then Article 4 of the Convention, again, now contained in the Human Rights Act, is the prohibition on slavery. And we know that there's modern-day slavery all over the world, but people forget about what's going on under their noses here in central London, here in Britain. And yes, it is partly about women who are trafficked and women who are working as prostitutes and who've been trafficked for that reason. But it's also about women who come in as domestic servants. And did you know that whilst we had all these celebrations for the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade, until a few months ago, in Britain, there was no criminal offence in this country of holding somebody under forced labour or in servitude. Did you know that? There was no criminal offence. And the reason why there is a criminal offence today of holding someone in servitude is because of a woman called Patience. And Patience was a client of ours at Liberty. She came originally from Nigeria, and she came to Britain with her employer. And they came in together, and she was here to live amongst the family and be a kind of au pair, domestic servant. But she never got paid. And she lived and worked, sometimes for 18 or 20 hours a day, without being paid. Her passport was held. She lived in fear of being deported because her employer, another lawyer, by the way, her employer, told her that if she went to the authorities, she would be deported. She was beaten by her woman lawyer employer on a semi-regular basis. But, the bruises heal, and the assaults in question would probably never be serious enough for a custodial penalty had Patience had the courage at the time to go to the police. The door wasn't locked, so it wasn't false imprisonment. All sorts of potential collateral criminal offences, but the offence that there should be of holding someone as a slave was not on the statute book. And when Patience eventually plucked up the courage to go to the Metropolitan Police sent her away. And she, I'm glad to say, through other agencies came to us. And one of my colleagues at Liberty was able to bring a judicial review against the police and to threaten the government, I'm afraid, because sometimes we do have to threaten governments, not always, but sometimes, threaten the government with proceedings in the Court of Human Rights, the government failing in its duty to protect patients and others, failing in its duty to properly outlaw slavery in Britain in 2009, as it was. And as a result of that threatened litigation and a lot of campaigning and lobbying, first without success and then eventually with success, we were able to table an amendment to the Coroners and Justice Bill, now an act, get cross-bench support in the House of Lords, and eventually the government caved. We don't call for new criminal offences very often at Liberty, so that was quite an interesting moment. And because of Patience, that woman from Nigeria, there is now a very serious criminal offence on the statute book in this country of holding someone as a slave. Article 5 of the Convention protects people from arbitrary detention. Now, we know there are all sorts of justifications for detaining people lawfully when you hold them pending criminal charge and prosecution, when you have convicted and sentenced them and they've committed a very serious offence and they're a danger to the public, when they're mentally ill and they're a danger to themselves and other people, and pending deportation. But in this country, we still hold women and children for weeks on end in the immigration system, vulnerable people who have done nothing wrong other than have a hope of protection as refugees here in Britain. And women with children generally do not disappear, because mothers have such a sense of responsibility to take care of their children. These are women who have been raped all over the world, who have been tortured. These are children who have seen terrible scenes in their country of origin, and they come to Britain thinking it's the promised land. Now, it may not be the promised land, but we ought to do better for these people than we currently do. And this week, my colleagues, I'm afraid, are in court yet again to challenge the government's policy of detaining women and children who are the low-hanging fruit of the immigration system. It is actually sort of young, fit men who can disappear and travel around and disappear into the black economy. It is the low-hanging fruit, women and children, who are being incarcerated with no need for weeks on end. And I hope that with the iron fist in the velvet glove, yes, negotiation, yes, appealing to people's reason and better judgment, but also with the benefit of the law, we will persuade the coalition government to honour its promise to end the detention of children in Yarlswood Detention Centre and elsewhere in this country. We have all these human rights values: dignity, equality, freedom, fairness, Article 3, Article 4, Article 5, free speech, Article 10, fair trials, Article 6. But to my mind, the key to the kingdom of realising human rights is contained in Article 14 of our Human Rights Act, and that is the principle of equal treatment. Because in truth, whatever they say in the newspapers and whatever people say from time to time, in particular when fear stalks the land, the fear of foreigners, the fear of terrorists, the fear of the other, the fear of recession, when fear stalks the land, people do value their own rights and freedoms. It's other people that they find a little less important. And in my experience, the principle of equal treatment is the discipline that can discipline democracies to treat minorities who have no power, to treat disenfranchised groups like children and asylum seekers as they would like to be treated. Treat others as you would like to be treated, a principle that you find in all the great world religions and in most civilizing philosophies as well. And surprise, surprise, it is the most important human rights value of all. You could talk for hours or days and I would bore you witless with where human rights come from. Do they come from God, or are they just an essential component of democracy? We can debate these things. Philosophers continue to debate them for hours and days, and it will go on forever. But this is Black History Month, and it is about celebrating heroes. And I can't think of a better human rights hero to remember on this occasion than Nina Simone. Now, I can't sing, and I'm not going to try, but I am going to remind you of some words of a famous song of one of my heroes, Nina Simone. I'm not going to sing them. But when I hear this song and when I remind myself of these words, I don't need to read the great philosophers anymore, and I don't need to agonize too much about why human rights matter as a celebration of humanity and life itself. Got my arms, got my hands, got my fingers, got my legs, got my feet, got my toes, got my liver, got my blood. I've got life. I've got my freedom. I've got the life, and I'm going to keep it. Thanks very much.